Your hosts are Jared and Jason, and you have arrived at the after party. The crown winner of last week is Maki, $25 financial gift. Big round of raucous emojis. Applause for this gentleman. Congratulations. Thank you so much. Second place, second week in a row, the one and only Rory, the gentleman Herbert, financially gifting 10 US dollars. God bless you and congratulations to you as well. Good brother. Folks, you may financially gift, as always, on Entropy, as soon as I have it up and running, and also on Cash App. The URLs for both are in the description below. Jared and I evenly share financial gifts with our guests on the after party. And today, as you can see, we have the one and only Semiogogue, aka Oliver, on tap with us. Oliver, please introduce yourself to our new guests and our esteemed community. Tell them where they can find you, and then Mr. George will take us into the conversation.
Well, thank you both very, very much for having me. As always, I'm sure many folks here know about me, since you have kindly had me on your show a number of times in the past. I have a channel of my own called Semiogogue. You can find that on YouTube. You can find that on BitChute. You can find that on Odyssey. You can also find me on Twitter and Telegram. I recommend everybody hook up with me over on Telegram and Odyssey, because the situation with the various platforms is as uncertain as both of you are well aware. Yeah, that's pretty much for me. It for me. I've been sort of out of the loop for a bit with moving. This is one of my first appearances back. Just did one very, very quickly with Tim Murdoch, White Rabbit, that I had scheduled a while back. So I'm very happy to be dipping my toe back in the water with you guys, old friends. And I should be doing things properly here again within the next week or two. So very, very happy to be back.
Yes, you're in the running for the most appearances on tap. So you're looking good, healthy. Look like you got some sun.
Yes, I no longer have the lizard pallor. Yes, I told Jason earlier I've been working on my cardio with daily bike rides through a hilly park. So that's been good for me.
Good. Well, it's kind of open season today. We just I know you've been taking care of your things in your own life, but it's always so interesting to get a Semiogogue brain dump on anything. So we've for anyone that's new, we've done that before, and it just it kind of goes where it will. But obviously, there's a lot of things that have gone on even in these first few months of 2022. There's the situation with Ukraine and Russia, and I know you're pretty keyed into geopolitics. I can't say that I am, but it's always good just for me to hear you on that anyway, because you make it interesting for me, and I'm sure if you make it interesting for me, then people who actually follow that stuff are very interested to hear your different perspectives. So I don't know if you want to start with that or things closer to home domestically, or we could go in a totally different direction and I don't know, talk about strawberry shortcake recipes, but I don't think that's going to cut it for today. Somehow I think we always seem to go a little deeper.
Yeah, for Russia, I don't know what I can really say. I have followed it a fair amount, but because of my various obligations at the moment, I can't follow it closely. It has been very, very interesting to me. I guess I'll just start throwing some things out there, and if there's any particular point, Jared or Jason, that you guys want me to expound upon, I'll try. The first thing is that I think it's a terrible tragedy that two white countries are fighting each other. It's a horrible situation, and I wish it were not happening. And unfortunately, it is. You know, the whole business of no more brother wars can get a bit trite at times, but the sentiment there is totally worth backing. You know, why should these people be killing each other? But I suppose that's a question that everybody across all of time has asked at various points. You know, sometimes it seems more clear, you know, the motivations for it than others. But yeah, that's the first aspect, is that it's a horrible horrible situation, because whichever side in the conflict emerges victorious, it's going to be at the price of relations between two groups of people who are close cousins, and that's at their furthest distance. And obviously they have a whole bunch of history, some of it good, some of it bad, together. So that's and a whole bunch of people are just getting dead, which is another problem with warfare. But beyond that, my particular take on it, and well, before I even give you a take, I should say that the most interesting thing about this for me is that we are being given a glimpse, and many other people have noted this, so it's certainly not an observation unique to me, but we are being given a glimpse of the way in which propaganda works during a state of war, with in a way that we would have great difficulty understanding it in the past. We've had the little micro wars. We've had things like the bombing of Belgrade, the NATO attacks on Serbia in the 90s. We've had things like Afghanistan, but those were not, we weren't talking about a land war in what's basically Europe. And we're seeing the way in which certain voices are getting, cut off, and the way in which other voices, let's just call them voices to be charitable, are being amplified. And so while this is a very interesting time to look around and try to get a sense of what's happening with media, as though any of us needed any further lessons on how duplicitous and malicious they can be, the other important thing to bear in mind is that when trying to have any take on this, any take at all, there is so much chaos, so much misinformation, disinformation, propaganda of various kinds, that it is exceedingly difficult. So in none of what I'm going to talk about here, should you assume that I have any kind of inside knowledge, and much of it could be way off. The main thing that I apply to having a take on this is just the historical realities. So when I'm assessing this, which group is most likely to come out on top, I'm just looking at the history of the region and the parties involved, more so than any particular reporting on the ground. But my take is that Russia is going to pay a high price, but will come out more or less victorious on this. However, I think that it's important to understand that this, if it ever was just Russia fighting Ukraine, if ever, it certainly is not that now. And so the conflict there seems to me to be between Russia on the one side and Ukraine as a kind of, sadly, as a kind of sock puppet for NATO and the United States. And so that's created a whole bunch of tension, I think, in the dissident right community, where a lot of people want to come down on the side of the Ukrainians because they've got sort of a pretty clear nationalist claim in terms of what they're doing and why they're doing it, at least superficially. Whereas other people on the dissident right are like, this is a situation where the Ukrainians have been stood up and backed by NATO and the US, or they'll talk about the GAE, the gay. So it's there's some bifurcations on the right about this. And as I said, if you're looking at it more broadly, and I think more intelligently from the perspective of pro-white, it's just a tragedy all around. But I think there are a lot of people over on the right who are just, they want to see NATO and people like Biden and creatures like Zelensky, who have been, spun up to run their dance on stage. They want to see them get a bloody nose. But I think in the end, it's going to be Russia that comes out on top at a high price.
But before we say anything else, just to clarify something and get it on record, I personally, I don't, dissident right, I don't even, to me, it's neither here nor there anymore. I don't think in that way. And it's, I don't know, if there's a club, I never got any kind of notification about my being in it or not being in it. But for anyone that would, for any reason whatsoever listen to this kind of show, there's obviously still, values and views that would bring someone here. So I just want to make sure we're clarifying. When you said that some are sympathetic to the Ukraine because of nationalistic tendencies, we might want to separate that from what the media in America is presenting as a representation of those nationalistic tendencies. Kind of the old school 1930s kind of thing going on. I'm not saying that there's not pockets of that there, but even people, I guess, on the more mainstream right or conservatives, there's this criticism that kind of thing is going on in the Ukraine, and therefore it must be crushed, right? But that is, I would imagine you're always a more nuanced thinker. I don't want to assume anything, but I just want to make sure that, for any maybe new party that's listening, that it's when you say those kind of nationalistic tendencies are in Ukraine, are not only talking about those kind of 1930s things going on, or are you? I don't want to make any assumptions.
Well, I had not even gone that far into it. I assume what you're talking about is the more sort of openly mid-century German-styled Azov battalions and that kind of thing.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think there probably are some of the people who how does Jason put it? The people who cling to dead symbols that are counterproductive.
And that's antique nationalist.
Yeah, I think that there's a certain number of people like that. And I tend to look askance at all of them. I think, just like you said, Jared, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but my assumption is that Jason's against that sort of thing simply on the basis of pragmatism. It does nothing but harm for, the efforts of people who are trying to take on the anti-whites when they adopt the postures and the symbols of people who are always going to be, the baddies. So I tend to,
and it goes beyond pragmatism if those people adopt what the narrative says that was about, and then try to embody that. So actually, when people actually do practice or preach what that was supposed to be about in kind of the mainstream way that it's thought about, and you actually take that on, then it goes beyond pragmatism, because whatever happened back then, obviously we're only given certain bits of information and not others. If you take if you take the narrative of what that was supposed to be, and then you adopt it and unironically get into what that was supposed to be about, what we're told it was, then I would say, at least for myself, I'll speak for myself, it's not just about pragmatism. It's not a view or way of going about life, value system that I want to be part of.
Yeah, well, it tends to it tends to confuse all sorts of things and lead you down all kinds of byways other than taking on anti-whites. So, it has that as an issue as well. And as you guys doubtless know, I'm not a big fan of mid-century wool uniforms and flashy uniform insignia. I know some people are. My point was really just that there are certain people on the right who make a lot of loud noise. I don't want to say their name simply because I don't want to give them airtime, so to speak. And I don't have any need for drama. I certainly don't want to bring drama to your channel as a guest. But there are people who get behind that in the sense that, oh, here's a clear-cut case of people who are fighting for their country, for their national identity. So that's sort of like the broader understanding of nationalism that I'm talking about. And then you have a much more specific group of people who think that, all the lightning bolt insignia and black suns and stuff that are favored by the Azov battalions just mean that they're your best buddy. I don't know that those people tend to look very, very closely at who stood up the Azov battalion people and funded them, which is a very interesting subject in and of itself. Very, very interesting when you think about the people who are standing up and putting money behind the massive immigrant influx. And so when you start thinking about the idea that the same people, at least possibly, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, and as Jason often says, go get your news from CNN, from a trusted source. But when you take a look at the people who have put money behind the Azov Battalion and the kind of people who've also put money behind waves of opportunistic migration into Europe, and you entertain the notion that it could be the same people doing it, then you can at least glimpse the possibility, because I'm not going to say it's a certainty, but it's a possibility, that the stage has been set for a dramatic series of actions in the future that would serve to reinforce all of the worst negative stereotypes about whites possible.
Right. Like the people resisting this, the wonderful, unending, culturally and racially extremely consequential migration in unnatural numbers and unnatural speed. The only people opposing this thing would be what we were just saying a moment ago, that worst Hollywood cutout one-dimensional stereotype of any person of European descent that cares one iota about their heritage, way of life, people, etc. What about, let's speak about Russia for a minute, and this might help all of us because, again, some like me are not really the most politically inclined or follow geopolitics. And then I know you said yourself maybe haven't been following this as closely. So maybe even it might help to put it in context of the last several years. Again, I know you have a pretty fine-tuned awareness of geopolitics. And for anyone that doesn't know, you had lived in Turkey for some years and know that kind of, obviously that's not Russia, but you kind of know that neck of the woods, that zone where Eastern Europe and the Middle East and Russia, all there's kind of some overlap in gray areas, and the Caucasus, and you're very attuned into that. So I'll put it to you this way to simplify it and clarify it. We saw, going back to Trump's campaign, this vilification of Russia and this reviving of this idea of Russia as this great enemy. Obviously, Trump's political enemies tried to pin this whole collusion with Russia for years on him. How do you square that now? Like put this conflict in context of large parts of the American media, political establishment having set up Russia as this enemy for many years now.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, and something that I've thought quite a bit about over the years, is the idea that we now have sort of three great powers. So you no longer have the bifurcation that was characteristic of Cold War I, right? So some people have started to talk about all of this as Cold War II, which in some respects is fitting, though, it certainly seems hot enough in the Ukraine at the moment. And so when you have three players on the board, then what's most important is managing the way in which they might form power blocks one with the other. If you want to think about it in the most simple sense, think about families where you have two siblings, right? Like, so I come from a two-sibling family, right? There are just two brothers in my family. And that has with it a very, very specific kind of dynamic. I think once you introduce three, it's something else entirely because of the way the relationships can unfold. And that's just a sort of
because the other two could always make some kind of alliance, you're saying,
right? And beat your ass out in the yard,
Fascinating, by the way. I didn't know you had a brother. Fascinating as to what Oliver's brother might be like. Wow.
How do we know we haven't had Oliver's brother on before? They look so much alike.
Well, when we used to work as doormen together, actually, we'd get confused sometimes. Well, we intentionally dressed the same way, but that was long ago. I'm far more fit and attractive and younger too.
You look, but you look that similar.
Fairly similar. I'm told we sound similar. We certainly have the same speech patterns and things, having the same parents. But the main point is, of course, that when you have three, you have to deal with the possibility that any two will form a grouping against the remaining one. And so I think what we saw when Trump came in was there was probably some opportunistic stuff saying, look, we don't want to piss off the Chinese because they're funding us. So who can we say that is a big baddie that we can associate Trump with? Well, let's just do the Russians. But I think at the same time, it very much serves China's interests to ensure, right? Because China's going to be doing two things. It's going to want to ally with any other party against the remaining one because it makes its position unassailable. But likewise, it's going to have to keep the other two. And these are two very distinct paths that they'd have to follow in terms of anticipating future stuff and taking action about it. They would have to have sort of their own separate thing that would just be about, no matter what, don't let Russia and the United States come together because of what kind of results this could have for us. And so I think to some extent it was a target of opportunity to just say, oh, Trump was doing, oh, it was the Russians. But at the same time, I think that there was some Mandarin thinking in the background, if you will, that where they saw the fact that no matter what, this could not be allowed to happen. And I bring this up now because it relates to what's going on in Ukraine at present. By pitting, and I'm not claiming that this is just something that China is doing. There are many moving parts. China plays a role. It's not the only role. However, let's not say by pitting. Let's use a passive voice. Or let's say in a situation where the United States, NATO, and to some extent, only to some extent, Europe are against Russia, Russia has to turn in the other direction. It has to start selling energy. It has to start forming tighter economic bonds with countries like China. So this war serves China very, very well indeed. Very, very well indeed, because Russia is pushed more closely into their arms. And Russia, for example, they've got their energy sector, which is one thing. The United States and NATO are trying to block their provision of energy to Europe. But at the same time, Russia also does have a significant arms industry. And there's only a certain amount of weapons that they can sell to the Chinese because they'll be reverse engineered and copied in very, very short order. But now Russia is increasingly in a situation where it's like, well, the hell, I mean, we need to make money and we've got to, we can't be too picky about this relationship with China now. We've got to throw them some kind of a bone, which puts them in a weaker position. Also, I should throw in there that there is the business of India. And India was coming around over to the U.S. side with Trump having, huge rallies with Modi in the United States that just, if you ever see pictures of the stadium when Modi came out while Trump was in office to the U.S. and the number of people who showed up there in the stadium, you could talk about the biggest Trump rallies and be like, wow, that was pretty big. They're dwarfed by the numbers of Indians in the United States who came out when Modi appeared. So it looked like India and the United States were aligning quite nicely in that fit. They were doing the Quad thing against China together with Australia and Japan. But now India doesn't seem to want to get on board with all the business that NATO and the United States are pushing against Russia. And so they're kind of inching over to the Russian side. I won't say that they're inching over to the Chinese side, but they certainly are kind of trying to maintain their neutrality and at the same time keep their good relationship with Russia. And a lot of Americans don't know it, but for the entire period of the Cold War, Russia was a huge ally of India and has provided weapons to them and all kinds of other things. And now, you've got things like the BrahMos missile program where India and Russia are cooperating on this hypersonic cruise missile. So India is also getting it's going through some sort of desynchronization relative to its relationships with the West, at least to some extent. So now you got a situation where Russia, China, and even India, to some extent, could be over here saying, well, I don't know if we're totally on board with this. There's some meme jokes that go around showing maps where they talk about the whole world being against Russia. And you'll see that it's basically, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Europe, Canada, and the United States. And you see that there's just this enormous amount of the world that is not on board with all of this. So anyway, the point here is that Russia is in some respects being pushed into the arms of China, which to me, if you apply the cui bono, the who benefits test, then it looks like China could easily be one of them. But I think another major factor here is energy getting into Europe. There's a whole lot of Black Sea natural gas and oil. And if Russia takes the Black Sea coastline of Ukraine, then there's no longer Ukraine's ability to claim that as their territorial waters. And then when you start looking at things like Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and Burisma, making no claims here, get your real news from CNN. All of this is sheer speculation. But it seems to me that a lot of very, very crooked, and I mean very crooked, like crooked is a dog's hind leg crooked. A lot of very crooked oligarchs have been living it up in the wild west of Ukraine, where they can literally do anything for quite some time. And they had turned it into their little personal fiefdom. And I think that there's a lot going on there with European energy games, up and coming new regions where energy can come in to play. As well as the geostrategic picture of having, more than two great powers and how all of that balances out. I probably didn't answer your question well, but in terms of Russia's perspective, I think you can't leave China out. You can't leave their defense against NATO out. And you've got the huge trans-European plane there, right, which doesn't have a lot of natural barriers. So they're concerned about people getting too close to them. And you can't leave out all these energy games and crooked oligarch games that have been going on in Ukraine for quite some time now.
You mentioned when you first began seeing in real time how propaganda works. Just to open it up broadly, admittedly, even more speculative, just in the spirit of taking the temperature of different scenes, I wonder if you can tell us maybe a little bit about the mainstream, like the people that just watch network news and take it's not much more than that, of what the American public is being presented with this. And then also, same question for just social media and the Twitter bubbles and that kind of thing. Just to give you a little direction with that second part with the Twitter bubbles, because you mentioned Ukraine earlier, I'll say there's also the mirror image of Russia, where there's a very one-dimensional cutout version of this meme where Russia is the bulwark of traditionalism and that all of the New World Order is against them and that Russia will save us, that kind of thing. So the same spirit of the question, but two prongs, the mainstream and then some of the Twitterati.
Yeah, the mainstream I can't say a whole lot about because I just I'll leave it to other people to get their authoritative news from CNN.
But I'm sure that to some degree what the general public is being presented, and then reverse engineering that. How do you square that as what the American public is trying to be trained to think about this?
Yeah, it seems to me that they're just being told Russia bad, Russia ferocious demon, Russia bombing children, Russia destroying infrastructure, Russia furious war of aggression. He just wants to take over all of Europe. What else did they say? As soon as he takes Ukraine, that's just going to be a stepping stone for him to go further. They'll go after the Baltic countries. He wants to restore Russia's claim to these various territories that used to be behind the Iron Curtain, blah, 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 blah.
Now, do you think there's elements of truth in that? Or do you think
Russia has shown that
one-dimensional propaganda?
It's just, it's just nonsense as best I can tell. Russia has shown a very steady strategy of just keeping a few key points where it can't control vast amounts of territory. It just keeps key points. As I've talked about many times, you guys have probably heard me. Hell, I've probably talked about it at least once here on your streams. Look at Ukraine. They didn't go after all that territory at first. They got Lugansk and Donetsk. They took Crimea. Then when backed by NATO, or at least by Soros and others, Georgia wanted to move into South Ossetia. They just took South Ossetia. Nothing else. A lot of people don't know that that's sort of runs alongside and controls access to the main path of the old Georgian military highway, which is like one of the only ways that you can get through north-south through the Caucasus Mountains more or less year-round. So it wasn't about South Ossetia, it was about controlling the one gate in what Russia sees as its fortress wall on its south, which is the Caucasus Mountains. But they didn't take back all of Georgia, which they had indirectly controlled for quite some time back in the day. They worked out a relationship, an ironic one, given that they used to be enemies, with Abkhazia, one of the Caucasian sort of micro countries there, south of the Caucasus. They kept Transnistria. They took Crimea. So see, they want to be able to control Ukraine because it's historically been in their sphere of influence, whether it was, you get some cases in the past where Poland, when it was a great power, would contest with Russia for control of Ukraine. But for most of the recent history, Ukraine has been in the sphere of Russia, whether it be the Soviet Union or Russia as an empire. So they want to control that territory to have that buffer. It's also an enormous breadbasket for them, and it's got considerable mineral resources, and we just talked about energy. But my point is that they don't need to take all that territory in order to control it. They kept some troops in Transnistria, in Crimea. They set some up in Abkhazia. They got South Ossetia, Donetsk and Luhansk. So they've kind of set themselves in these various areas without having to take huge amounts of territory, because all they have to control is the primary ground that they would expand from if anything were to go down. And that's what we're seeing with what they're doing in Ukraine. If you take a look at Kaliningrad, you can basically just draw a line from Kaliningrad in the north down to say Crimea in the south, or Transnistria actually is pretty close to the perfect spot. And that line from Kaliningrad, which for people who don't know, it's a Russian enclave up in the Baltic area, where they keep troops and defense emplacements and everything, and they haven't turned it over to any of these other countries. Even as NATO has pushed past it.
It's like a land island that.
Right.
Yeah.
And it fits the same pattern as all their other things, where they just keep the one spot they need. In the case of Transnistria and Kaliningrad, you could draw a line between the two of them, and what you'll see is that is at the narrowest waist of Europe. And for Russia, that matters. They've had Napoleon come through. They've had Hitler come through. The trans-European plain doesn't have a whole bunch of barriers to stop anyone other than mud and distance. So for them, if you draw a line from Transnistria to Kaliningrad, you'll see it's sort of at the narrow waist of Europe. That is the point at which they kind of want to be if they ever had to defend against enemies coming from Europe, because that's the narrowest point of that sort of land transition from Europe into Asia. And as soon as they get like further off of that, the front that they have to maintain troops along becomes that much wider, which means their troops become that much thinner, meaning that they have that much increased cost to defend any given area of it. So my point is that they don't have to go after, they'd come into Ukraine and then they just sweep through the rest of Europe. No, they have shown consistently that they're pursuing a policy of a few concentrated little areas where they keep their resources to move forward from if it becomes necessary. So in the news, they tell these same kinds of stories. Your general, the Hun is coming from the east and wishes to destroy our way of life. The same sort of slapdash, nonsensical propaganda that you would see in World War I or World War II, or it's same old story. The rape of the nuns in Belgium. They blew up the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor. Blah blah blah. That's the mainstream sort of talking points. The people are suffering. The water supplies have been damaged. Putin is a dictator. That kind of nonsense.
Go ahead, please.
For the social media side of things, it's a little bit more complicated, because Russia has actually deployed all kinds of resources to create its own counter narratives.
Right, right. Yeah, that I should have said that too. We can't deny the fact that that's likely going on, and that some of the celebration of Russia is not this purely organic thing. It The two connect because for people like us who look so askance at whatever the media tells us, because we know all the manipulations and lies on many fronts, on many topics. When you go and you drive around suburban America and you see little Ukrainian flags now everywhere, and all just the people who go to work and come home and watch network news or Netflix, this is what they're doing. They're putting up the Ukrainian flags. So anyone who it, it's a common thing, and we've all been there. I've certainly been there, where you think, okay, the opposite of what the mainstream media is telling us must be the truth, but that's not a foolproof thing either. But I know there's a temptation, especially for people who are more at least adjacent and tangential to our circles here, the circles that go out to other circles. Um, that Russia has the right enemies, and therefore we get this collapse into this, again, very simplistic, they're the saviors of traditionalism and will ultimately revive everything that we care about in the West. And it's a seductive kind of narrative, but I wouldn't think it's that cut and dry either.
No, nor is that argument convincing when you look, for example, at the ideas of somebody like a Dugin, in terms of what he sets forth. And I'm no expert on it. There are many, many other people you should go listen to who actually have studied him. I have not, but a superficial consideration shows that Dugin is big into the idea of, how do I say this? His thinking seems, oddly, it must be a coincidence, perfectly suited to support the kind of attitudes you would have to have if you wanted to maintain what was a multi-ethnic post-Russian empire. So there is no focus, for example, on white well-being at all. There is no focus on the idea that white people's destinies should be taken back into their own hands. There's no support for any of those kinds of ideas. And it's not just from Dugin, for example, despite the fact some people might have been, seduced by the early kinds of things that you would have heard out of somebody like a Richard Spencer in terms of Dugin and Russia. They don't have any time for a bunch of, anything from a white positive all the way over into the realm of Wignats or whatever. They have no interest in it. They do not support it. And it's not just Dugin. You can also hear it from all kinds of Kremlin mouthpieces and the rest. There's nothing based about Putin, in my view, except relative to all the kind of politicians we're saddled with further west. He is at least willing to fight. He is at least willing to draw a line and then do something once it's crossed. But he's not my hero. He's not my friend. And he's making war on a European country. I do think he's doing it for reasons that are sufficient for himself and for Russia and Russians, and I can't blame him for that. I do think that there are any number of behind-the-scenes provocations that went on from NATO's side that pushed him to do it. I don't know it for sure, but if I had to bet, I'd bet on it. But yeah, so the Russian state doesn't seem to have interest in any of these things, that would concern, for example, viewers of this channel. Or I should say, there are plenty of things that concern viewers of this channel, but let's say the primary concern for viewers of this channel, I don't think you're going to find Russians as some kind of a big ally, as big allies for that, except incidentally, except in the sense that the Russians are still. I said it a long, long time ago, and I'll say it again. I don't think of them as my friends, but I do think of them as the last group of white people who see no real need to apologize for anything. And so that, I think, is a positive characteristic of theirs. But to the point about the the way the mainstream media is portraying this. I think we kind of covered that. For the realm of social media, I think everything from like Coach Red Pill to Russians with Attitude, or more softly operations like the Duran. I'm not saying that any of these parties are or are not specifically paid for by the Russian state. But they're definitely, they take a pro Putin, pro Russia line, and I think that there is quite a lot of that out there that, to one extent or another, or to some extent, is backed directly or indirectly by Russia, that kind of create a voice for themselves on these alternative platforms. They're highly sophisticated people. The Russian intelligence services, highly sophisticated, highly capable. Anybody who says that, simply because RT has been shut down, or that you can't get a Sputnik feed, that Russia can't get its voice out there, or that they've been, blocked off, I think it's nonsense. Whatever you want to say about the Russians, and I'll say all kinds of things about them, they are, number one, capable, number two, formidable. They should not in any sense be dismissed, and they have considerable subtlety and sophistication. But there was a third portion. It was what's going on with the general media, and then what's going on with the social media side of things. And I'm forgetting now, there was a third point.
No, there were really just two, but kind of going on this theme. And again, I know this is speculative, but under the same heading, there are some who think that there are ties to COVID with this, and certain areas in Ukraine that have been bombed for specific reasons. Obviously, we have to choose our words carefully to protect Jason's channel on YouTube. But I think you might know what I'm implying. Not that I'm implying it. I'm indicating what people are talking about. I'm not saying I believe something one way or the other.
Yeah, there's the business of, the so-called, let us say, research. Let's just call them research facilities. That the claims of many research facilities across the Ukraine that could be conducting research on things that could be related to things that we're not supposed to talk about. Is that elliptical enough? Yeah, I tend to see that as that's just a freebie. That just gives everybody something to talk about. I'm not saying that some sort of research wasn't undertaken there, but I don't see it.
It's a Wild West, as you said. So
yeah, but I mean, what's for this kind of thing? This is less about. I mean, how much I don't know. I'm not. I don't have a lab experience. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a physician. So your mileage may vary. Take this for what it's worth. Nobody here is paying anything to hear me say this, so you know what it's worth, which is close to nothing. But as raw speculation goes, when you're talking about something that can be contained and kept within a pretty tight circle, like off the books operation of labs for some nefarious purpose, you don't need a whole country to conduct that in. All you need is, a facility where somebody looks the other way while you have a small staff that does what it needs to do. So maybe there's something there. I wouldn't rule anything out at this point. But that to me just looks straight up like Russia saying, hey, here's a freebie. There are a bunch of labs that are funded here. Let's create a whole talking point about how this could be related to this. And who else benefits from this whole narrative being put forward? It's the Chinese. So they're going to be more than happy to hammer home that point too, because then they can say that everything that formerly was blamed on them. And I'm not taking a position about it one way or another. Totally agnostic, at least, on this public stream. So I don't tend to put much stock in those claims, but I've been dramatically wrong in the past.
Any other interesting, wild internet theories, but worth consideration? I know you sometimes tune into different live streams. People who think about these things, research these things, and consider them. Anything that you might not necessarily you come down one way or the other, but you think it's interesting to consider or noteworthy to just put on record in this conversation? What are other people that you respect talking about and what are their kind of takes on this? That anything that's resonated?
I don't know that there are any that really stand out to me as being dramatic or unexpected or some really new take, but there are a whole lot of people covering this, both on the dissident right and on the dissident left, because there are a bunch of leftists too who are like, man, this stinks, I don't buy this. But I haven't followed them up. I haven't done any kind of comprehensive survey or even a half-assed survey about it, so I don't know that I've heard any hot takes on it that you guys will not have heard of, other than the one that I offered up at the more or less at the beginning of the stream. And I wish I could remember who it was who raised the point. It was on Twitter, and it was in the last week, and I remember retweeting and mentioning that it was interesting. But it was this whole point about the possibility that the same people funding the Azov group could be related to the same people funding mass opportunistic migration. And that, to me, that's really something interesting to think about, because we saw the way in which, I mean, you can argue one way or another about it. As I said, I'm not into black wool uniforms. I'm not into goose stepping, and I'm not into trying to resurrect old patterns that do nothing but me and my people harm. But so you can look at what happened with that whole mid-century German experiment, and it has basically been an engine that has been used to drive like one of these rotating wheels, and at the end of it is just a series of sledgehammers that just hammer people endlessly. That whole mid-century German thing has been used to just beat white people into pulp for half a century now. And so, and we know that there were all kinds of interesting people funding them early in the game. And so I can't say anything for sure about this, and there are a whole lot of autists about history and people into revisionism who know a lot more about this than I do, so I'm not going to try and make any claims for it, but it's at least worth entertaining the notion that in the past, those people served as a beautiful cudgel, at least after the fact, and maybe it was planned, but certainly at least after the fact, to just beat white people with endlessly. And so it does not seem to me to be outside the realm of possibility that you could have a group of people, very interesting group of people. They share some characteristics, funding Azov and also funding opportunistic migration. And who would want to put those two pieces on the board at the same time and create, on the other side of things, it's entirely possible that that we're just looking at something that was very specifically opportunistic. If you wanted to get a fanatical group of people who were true believers in a particular ideology and willing to fight the hardest and train the hardest and commit entirely into defending an area that was going to be critically important in the future, sure, maybe they could engender that kind of, or they could support the spread of a given ideology in that region because it suited their narrow purposes. But in terms of hot takes, to me, it's very interesting to just lean back and go,
One of those things that make you go, from that old rap song, I think it was. Or rap, I guess they're not songs. But nonetheless, folks, we're going to be tapping out here very shortly because that would top of the hour roughly. So get your comments or questions, your financial gifts in now as soon as you can. And while you do, over the next 5 minutes, we will give Oliver an opportunity to talk about moving.
Yeah, man.
Totally a gear switch. Can I throw in one more question on this before we get to Oliver's move and lighter subjects? And just real quickly, because again, it's something spoken about in different circles online. What is going on with Zelensky and his background of allegedly as an actor, and even a strange video of him being in this odd cross-dressing dance routine? Do you have anything on that? I'm just going to throw that in the pot as a wild card.
Well, here, I'll give it to you like this. Before he became president, certain very rich people in the Ukraine decided that they would put him out into the public. He's a sort of, I don't know, B-list. I don't know what you call it when you're B-list in a small country, right? But for Ukraine, he seems to have been a B-list sort of, comedian. A huge amount of money got pumped into producing. Can't remember the name of it. Somebody in the chat can probably tell all of us, but he became the star of a television show about a guy who, just a normal guy who becomes president of the Ukraine.
Wow.
Weird, right before he ran. And then it gets better. The staff of the television show, funded by this billionaire, he brought them over with him into office as his staff and his advisors.
Wow.
So how do you explain that?
I mean, it literally sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, an absurdist
it's kind of
dystopian
like
novel.
Yeah, it's kind of like we are onto something here when we talk about in Going Free, that the subconscious mind can't tell the difference between reality and fiction, and thereby it's possible to prep people for a reality by way of fiction. It's almost like that's accurate or something.
As a matter of fact, it is. It's something, I noted it. I recently read, in the last couple of years now, in the last year and a half, I finally read Going Free. I'd, of course, read your Born Guilty before that. And I've thought about similar things. I've talked about it in terms of the persona. So you've got the basic idea of an ego as a self-understanding, and then persona, the old word, basically means mask. So you have a different persona that you hold up in different situations because it offers advantages, right? So you're not going to use the same persona when you're trying to get a bank loan as you are when you're dealing with a cop who pulled you over, or with your preacher at church, or with a woman that you're trying to ask out on a date. They're all going to be different persona, and those persona are going to be personae, are going to be aligned towards performing some function. And so by adopting that persona, you get a survival advantage, right? And so what they do in all these fictional realms is they portray utterly unsuccessful behavior as though it is successful. And because basically, I could talk about this, as I'm sure both of you could, for quite some time, because it seems to be the technique du jour, right? Like, so for example, even if transsexuals amount to some very small percentage of the population overall, they're going to be presented on television and in films as though they're a part of every friend group, as though they're in every situation. Yeah, it's endless, the way in which non-successful attitudes and behaviors are presented as successful. One of my favorite is always keeping the finger off the trigger. Yes, you should absolutely keep your finger off the trigger, but if you're now at the point where you think there's some intruder in your house and you know that your kids are behind you, I'm not saying that Jason's channel supports this. This is not a gun channel. You can have a political channel or you can have a gun channel. Can't have both. But for this example, put your damn finger on the trigger, right? Or like look in rap videos, how they endlessly show people holding pistols sideways, right? I mean, now some of this is actually very, very interesting for me, because it teaches people to get themselves killed or to be hurt badly because they have no idea how to confront this situation. And I think there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah. Well, you haven't had any of that with your moving, is that right?
With my moving, man. I just want to say, as a kind of brotherhood, anybody out there who is also going through a move or has been doing so recently, man, I feel you, brother, or I feel you, sister. It's craziness out there, man. And it signals a lot of changes going on. I have now looked in 2 adjacent southeastern states for property, and And I've spoken to a number of sellers as well as real estate agents, and I've asked them the same sorts of questions. I'm like, how much of this is coming from like REITs things where you can set up funds to buy property in bulk, almost like you're buying and selling it with the stock market through these funds? How much of it is from, your BlackRock type stuff, or how much of it is from people actually fleeing the cities? And the answer in all the cases where I talk to somebody, and these are people on the ground dealing with it, is both, and quite a bit. There are huge numbers of people trying to get out of bigger cities that really, are having a lot of problems. It's the reason I want to move out of mine. But likewise, there are a lot of people just stepping right in and paying enormous amounts of money comparatively for properties that just 2 years ago wouldn't have gotten a second glance. Like, the reason I had to pounce on the property I found is because I just looked at so many where you have some dog-eared single wide on like 5 acres, and it's just a dump. Nothing against single wide. If it's good and clean on a good piece of property, I'll take a single wide any day. But what I'm saying is, you got like pieces of property that are just in terrible condition where they're asking high prices, and it's just because so many people are trying to get out there and get out of the cities. Likewise, there are huge numbers of people, of funds, companies, corporations, some of them from outside the United States, as though it matters in our transnational framework. So it's a weird scene, man. It's a very, very weird scene. There's a lot of rural property changing hands now, and there are a whole lot of places where people got to live sort of their own way, and now they're getting an influx. And in some cases, you could say, like in mine, where I'm like, I'm from the area roughly. I've got experience with the area. As I told my house when I put the earnest money down, I said, look, here's my offer. I can pay you cash. This is earnest money right here in front of you now. I don't need financing, and I'm not a damn Yankee. Right. So that kind of thing is part of it. But you also have a lot of people who are from far away. Like the house I bid on, they're like, oh, we just got an offer like, an hour before you got out here, and it's somebody from Illinois who wants to buy it as a rental property.
Wow.
The whole American landscape, in conjunction with being able to do the remote work thing and the teleworking and Elon Musk's Starlink and internet connectivity in rural areas, we're just beginning to see the change that's coming to these rural areas. So I just paid to buy the feeling that I'm separate from it all.
Right.
And quiet and some privacy. But in reality, the eye of Sauron, so to speak, the various ways that data are, is interconnected and cross-reference correlated. I don't know. It's a crazy thing. If you're buying and selling out there, I feel for you. Hopefully you'll get it over with quickly. And hopefully you'll end up in a good area, but it's been quite something of a journey for me. I wouldn't have it otherwise. I'm happy to go where I'm going, but I don't have any illusions about getting away. It's ever more important to focus on the kind of issues that Jason and Jared are talking on here about frequently, because though it might feel like running away, and though it's or retreating to a better position, and that there are good arguments to do that. You can move and get better school districts and less crime and less risk of being attacked by anti-whites, but we have to focus on the things that matter, which is, changing our own approach to things and spreading the word in productive ways, because we're running out of places to run to.
Yeah. Is it possible, real quick, before I know you got to roll, is it possible that we're looking at, in the next 10 years, as far as real estate is concerned, if things continue? We know that things rarely continue as they are this very moment. But if they do, or somewhere analogous enough, that the exurbs become the future suburbs, that the suburbs become populated with anti-whites of various races. And then you have the issue like you have now in suburbs that abut cities, where the predation encroaches and then washes over those communities. Is that a possibility for the excerpts, or are we talking about an area that is too large for it to be that widespread?
I don't know. It depends on how many more people you bring in. I mean, I think it would be interesting. You might want to see if you could get some channel followers, maybe appear anonymously or something, for reasons that will swiftly become very clear. Bring in some people with experience in suburban and rural law enforcement and ask them what they're dealing with out in those areas. I think that would be a place to get information that would be more reliable than any I could offer. But I did notice two things, and it's interesting that you bring this up. The one was I was looking at a lot of rural properties, and really they just seemed like if you took the sort of, 1.5 acre lot with a McMansion on it, and you just multiplied it by 10. So you had something like roughly a 10 acre or an 8 acre plot with maybe a slightly bigger house, maybe the same size. Everything's more spread out. But looking at it from above and how the property boundaries were drawn, there really is this thing that isn't rural and isn't suburban that I began to see, and I was like, oh wow, this is just like the suburbs, except all the lots are 10 times as large, but they're distributed along the road in the same way. There's no sense that you're too far from any kind of big box store. So that's one aspect. The other point that I would throw in is that for many years now, like when I came back from Turkey, I was hanging out with a few Turkish friends, and none of them lived in the city. They'd always be like, yeah, come out to my place, and they all wanted to be in the suburbs. They wanted to be in some apartment community in the suburbs where it would look more green and they'd have a pool. They didn't want to be in any kind of urban anything. So I think that bears on your question. There's also a guy who's a very talented guitarist I used to go see out in the suburbs, and he is from India, and works in software and stuff. He did the same thing. So to your point, as soon as people from all these other countries come to the United States, they don't want to deal with crime, and they don't want to deal with certain high crime population cohorts. And so what they immediately do is move at least to the suburbs. And because many of these people are canny as regards making real estate purchases and the rest, they move even further out. And I think that would bear directly on what you're talking about and make it seem likely.
Yeah, I think so. It's going to be an interesting future. Prepare yourself, ladies and gentlemen. Let's see, before we give Oliver his chance to give his final thoughts, and we will bid him adieu and tell everybody where you can find him one more time. We have a $25, let's get a round of August emojis, for Western Regenerate, who has financially gifted $25. That's the $20 mark that we celebrate for, folks. He writes here, thank you so much, Western Regenerate. He writes, hi, Jason, Jared, and all. I'm going to a certain event next month and really hope to see you there. I don't know what event you're going to, but let me know. But I appreciate it. If not there, I hope someplace we get to meet. We also have the great No White Guilt Clips, financially gifting $5, a great champion, an unflagging champion. And he writes here, how does one ascertain the truth about current events and history, if that's even possible? Well, we're going to toss that to Oliver and allow him to answer. I know it will be edifying, and then he will give us his final thoughts and where you all can find him and his future content. Oliver?
How to... Can you repeat the question? It was how to understand
Absolutely.
Current events and...
Ascertain the truth about current events and history, and if that's possible.
I'm glad he added that part at the end, because whether it's possible, I don't know. So it's always going to be an approximation, and you're always going to be guessing. I mean, think about the number of times that any one of you has been, let's say, at a work event or a party, right? And you tried to get a read about what motivated the person across from you to say what they did about you, and then even think about yourself when you responded. And if you're of that particular type of introspective person, that thinks about your own motivations in saying or doing things after the fact, I mean, you could walk out of that situation, and that's something you had direct experience of, and recently, right, where you were just at a party or as I said, a work event, and you're driving home 30 minutes later, and you're like, damn, why did they say that? And who said that thing first? And wow, I wonder what motivated them. And hell, I don't even know what motivated me. So take that circumstance where you have your own direct empirical experience of it, and take a look now at a situation where you're getting everything at, second or third hand at some remove. And there can be no doubt that it's being spun up by competing parties to represent it in various ways. So yeah, I don't know that it's possible, but we have to try. So, do it with great skepticism.
Very well said.
And for me, you wanted me to, you can find my channel, Semiogogue, as well as A Safer Space. There still are those two channels, a bunch of old videos on A Safer Space. You can find that on YouTube, both channels. You can find both channels on BitChute. Semiogogue, the one channel, is over on Odyssey. And then there is Telegram and Twitter. And I believe I'm even still on Minds. So yeah, and then there is a cool thing being put together. It's coming up in the near future. Let me just pull this up so I can remember it, because Porridge got in touch with me about it.
Oh, hold on, Oliver, though. Is that made public yet?
Oh, thank you. Good. All right. I just wanted to totally rep my friends and discuss it. And it's probably too soon. So yeah, I will be doing something in future, but I can't tell any of you about it or I'd have to kill you. Metaphorically speaking, of course.
Mr. George, final thoughts, where folks can find you.
It's always a pleasure to speak with Oliver. I have thegreatorder.com. I have a music that's done, but I don't know how I want to go about releasing it. Might put some raw stuff out, just performances, because that goes well with the internet and how music is consumed these days. Like Oliver, last few months, I've been more consumed with some personal things I've had to take care of, but happy and ramping up to kind of return to regularly releasing music and doing my thing with that. So other than that, it's always a pleasure speaking with these two gentlemen. It's been an adventure now. It's been a few years, and we've checked in with each other on all kinds of levels and had these conversations in public with people interacting, and have learned a lot along the way. And it's always inspiring getting to know how your mind works and learning. That's one of my favorite ways of learning is just picking people's brains, which is I get to do that here. I just like asking people questions. I'd rather learn about these things from someone like Oliver, these different considerations, than have to fry my eyeballs scrolling Twitter feeds and seeing, having to sift through a lot of silly opinions, or even reading up on it. Because it's, as I said, it's not my particular forte, geopolitics, but I still have an interest in these things. And I hope some of you do too, listening to something like this, learning this way, just with friends, communally, having conversations. So we've had a lot now, we have a history. It was June of 2018 that we first spoke, Oliver. So going on 4 years.
Nice.
But
right on.
Yeah, it's fun. And my hat's off to both of you and everyone listening. Thank you for your time. I send you my love, and we'll speak soon.
Indeed, underscore all of that. Is wonderful having you on again, Oliver, and it's going to be many more visits in the future, my friend. The afterparty.tv, folks. If you're not already linked in, plugged in to the afterparty.tv, you have to be, because that's where you can find everything, no matter what the anti-whites do to us. It will always be available there. And we have here to put our smile on our faces as we bid you adieu and tap out. Anon, over on Entropy. Anon123 financially gifting $25. Let's get a round of raucous emojis for Anon123. $25 financial gift. Says here, the 3 coolest guys on the internet all in one spot. Must be my special day. Keep up the good work, guys. Well, God bless you. Thank you so much for that. And we look forward to seeing you all again next time.